The cameras loved Richard Blackwood. They always had. Standing behind the mahogany podium in the state capitol's grand hall, his silver hair catching the studio lights just right, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd with the confidence of a man who had never lost an election, Richard embodied everything the public wanted in their leaders: power, charisma, control. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed through the chamber, each word carefully measured, each pause calculated for maximum impact. "Today marks not just another legislative session, but a turning point in our state's history." The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Richard's campaign manager, David Chen, stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. This was Richard at his finest: commanding, presidential, unstoppable. But 37 miles away, in the pristine kitchen of their Georgian colonial mansion, Eleanor Blackwood wasn't watching her husband's speech. She was staring at a real estate brochure. The house in the photographs was modest, a charming cottage on the Oregon coast, weathered shingles and a wraparound porch that overlooked endless stretches of ocean. Nothing like the imposing estate she currently called home, with its marble floors and towering columns that made her feel more like a museum curator than a wife. Eleanor traced her finger along the property's description: quiet coastal retreat, perfect for those seeking solitude and new beginnings. New beginnings. The words sent a shiver down her spine, equal parts terror and excitement. She folded the brochure carefully and slipped it into the bottom drawer of her desk, beneath a growing collection of similar dreams: houses in Vermont, a small apartment in Paris, a cabin in Montana, each one representing a life she might have if she were brave enough to take it. The sound of her husband's voice drifted in from the television in the adjacent room. "My commitment to this state, to our future, remains unwavering. I will not rest until we have achieved everything we set out to accomplish." Eleanor closed her eyes. Unwavering commitment. Once those words would have filled her with pride. Richard's dedication to public service was what had attracted to him 23 years ago when they met at a charity gala. He was a young assemblyman then, idealistic and passionate about making a difference. She was a teacher, fresh out of graduate school, drawn to his vision of a better world. Now those same words felt like a prison sentence. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop, a text from her sister, Margaret, in San Francisco. "Watching Richard's speech. He looks presidential. You must be so proud. How are you holding up?" Eleanor stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "I'm fine, just tired." It wasn't entirely a lie. She was tired, bone-deep, soul-crushing tired. Tired of being the perfect politician's wife. Tired of standing beside him at campaign events, smiling until her cheeks ached while he shook hands and made promises she knew he'd break the moment something more politically advantageous came along. Tired of eating dinner alone while he worked late into the night, of sleeping in a bed that felt more like a museum display than a place where two people shared their lives. Most of all, she was tired of feeling invisible. The front door opened with its familiar heavy thud, followed by the sound of expensive shoes clicking against marble. Richard was home earlier than usual. The speech must have gone well. Eleanor quickly closed the laptop where she'd been researching the Oregon cottage and smoothed her blouse, slipping automatically into the role she'd perfected over 2 decades of marriage. "Eleanor?" His voice echoed through the cavernous foyer. "In the kitchen," she called back, already moving to the refrigerator to pull out the dinner she'd prepared hours earlier. Salmon with dill sauce, his favorite. She'd stopped making her own favorites years ago. Richard appeared in the doorway, still buzzing with the energy of his performance. His tie was loosened, his jacket draped over one arm, and his face wore the satisfied expression of a man who had just reminded everyone why he was in charge. "Did you catch the speech?" he asked, moving to pour himself a scotch from the bar cart they'd received as a wedding gift. 23 years later, it was one of the few pieces that had survived their various moves and renovations. "I caught some of it," Eleanor lied smoothly, plating his dinner with practiced efficiency. "It sounded like it went well." Better than well. The education reform bill is as good as passed, and the healthcare initiative will be fast-tracked by month end. The governor called personally to congratulate me. Richard settled into his chair at the head of their dining table, a massive piece of dark wood that seated 12, but almost always hosted only one. "That's wonderful, Richard."
He looked up from his plate as if suddenly remembering she was there. "You don't sound enthusiastic." "I'm sorry, I'm just tired. It's been a long day." "What did you do today?" The question was perfunctory, asked out of habit rather than genuine interest. Eleanor thought of the morning she'd spent volunteering at the literacy center, helping adults learn to read, work that fulfilled her in ways she'd forgotten were possible. She thought of the afternoon spent researching coastal properties and imagining what her life might look like if she had the courage to claim it. She thought of the hours spent preparing a dinner that would be eaten in relative silence while her husband's mind remained fixed on his next political move. "Just the usual," she said instead. "Errands, volunteering." Richard nodded absently, already scrolling through his phone. "David wants to set up a series of fundraising dinners next month. High-dollar donors. I'll need you there, of course. The optics are important. Family values, stable marriage, all of that." Optics. Everything in their life was about optics. The perfect house in the perfect neighborhood. The perfect wife who wore the perfect clothes and said the perfect things. Eleanor wondered sometimes if Richard even saw her anymore, or if he just saw a campaign prop that happened to share his name. "Of course," she murmured. They ate in silence after that, the only sounds the clink of silverware against china and the distant hum of Richard's phone as message after message rolled in. Campaign staff, donors, reporters, colleagues, everyone wanted a piece of him, everyone except the woman sitting at his table. When dinner was finished, Richard kissed her forehead, a gesture that had once been tender but now felt perfunctory, and retreated to his study. "I've got calls to make," he said, already walking away. "Don't wait up." Eleanor sat alone in the dining room for a long time after he left, staring at their wedding photo hanging on the far wall. They looked so young in the picture, so hopeful. Richard's arm was wrapped tightly around her waist, and they were both laughing at something the photographer had said. She could barely remember that version of herself, the woman who believed love could conquer anything, who thought political ambition and personal happiness could coexist. That woman had been naive. But maybe, Eleanor thought as she began clearing the dishes, she'd also been brave. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the ballroom of the Capitol Marriott, wearing a navy blue dress that Richard's stylist had selected and a smile that felt painted on. Around her, the state's political elite mingled and networked, their conversations a careful dance of ambition and strategy disguised as small talk. "Eleanor, darling," Patricia Wynne, the governor's wife, glided over with the practiced grace of someone who had been performing this role even longer than Eleanor had. "You look absolutely radiant. That color is divine on you." "Thank you, Patricia. You look wonderful too." Eleanor accepted the air kisses that constituted affection in their world, a world where genuine emotion was seen as a political liability. "I was just telling Margaret Hoffman about your literacy work. So admirable. Richard must be so proud of your commitment to education." Eleanor nodded and smiled, playing her part perfectly. But inside, she wondered if Richard even remembered what her volunteer work involved. When was the last time he'd asked about it? When was the last time he'd asked about anything that mattered to her? From across the room, she could see her husband holding court near the bar, surrounded by donors and party officials. His laugh carried over the ambient noise, genuine and warm, the laugh she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. He still had it when he was talking politics, still became animated and passionate when discussing policy or strategy. It was only at home, only with her, that the spark seemed to dim. "Don't you think, Eleanor?" Eleanor realized Patricia had been speaking and she'd completely zoned out. "I'm sorry, what was that?" Patricia's smile faltered slightly, a crack in the perfect facade. "I was saying how lucky we are to have husbands who care so deeply about serving the public. The sacrifices we make are worth it when we see the difference they're making." Sacrifices. The word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. What had she sacrificed? Her career. She'd been a promising teacher with plans to become a principal before Richard's political aspirations required a full-time campaign spouse. Her dreams of travel. Every vacation was either a political necessity or canceled due to Richard's schedule. Her friendships. Most of her old friends had drifted away, finding it difficult to relate to her new life, while her new acquaintances were all political connections, rather than genuine relationships. Most painfully, she'd sacrificed the hope of children. Richard had wanted to wait until his career was more established, until the timing was right politically. Year after year, he'd promised they'd start a family soon, after the next election, after the next promotion. Now, Eleanor was 46, and soon had become never. The nursery she'd hopefully prepared in their second home had long since been converted to Richard's campaign headquarters. Yes, Eleanor managed, the sacrifices. She excused herself and made her way to the ladies' room, needing a moment away from the performance. In the mirror, she saw a woman who looked successful and polished, every detail perfectly curated. But her eyes looked hollow. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister Margaret. Saw the photos from tonight's event online. You look beautiful, but tired. Are you okay? Really okay? Eleanor stared at the message, her carefully constructed facade cracking just slightly. Margaret had always been able to see through her, even from 3,000 miles away. How could her own husband, who slept beside her every night, not notice what her sister could see in a photograph? Before she could second-guess herself, Eleanor typed back, "Can you talk tomorrow? I need to tell you something." The response came immediately. "Of course, call me anytime. I love you, Ellie." Ellie. Margaret was the only person who still called her that, her nickname from childhood, from a time when she was just Eleanor, not Mrs. Richard Blackwood, not the perfect political wife, just Ellie, who taught third graders and dreamed of making the world a little bit brighter. When she returned to the ballroom, Richard was giving an impromptu speech to the gathered crowd. He spoke passionately about education reform, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhetoric. The audience hung on every word. "And that's why my wife Eleanor's work in literacy education is so important to our shared vision," he said, gesturing to her. "She reminds me every day why we fight for these causes." The crowd turned to her, applauding politely. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from pride, but from anger. He was using her again, turning her work into talking points, her life into campaign material. And the worst part was, it wasn't even accurate. When was the last time they discussed her volunteer work? When was the last time they discussed anything meaningful at all? She smiled and waved graciously, playing her part one more time. But something inside her had shifted. The crack that had been forming for months, maybe years, had suddenly become a chasm. After the event, they rode home in silence, the back seat of their town car feeling like a vast empty space between them. Richard was on his phone, naturally, fielding calls and messages from the evening's contacts. Eleanor watched the city lights blur past the window and thought about the cottage in Oregon, about waking up to the sound of waves instead of campaign strategy sessions. "Good turnout tonight," Richard said finally, pocketing his phone as they pulled into their circular driveway. "Yes, it was. Did you get a chance to talk to Senator Morrison's wife? David thinks she could be helpful with the women's vote in the primary." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Even her conversations, her relationships were being calculated for their political value. We spoke briefly.
Inside the house, Richard headed straight for his study, muttering something about emails that couldn't wait until morning. Eleanor stood in their grand foyer, surrounded by expensive furniture and political memorabilia, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life.
She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, past family photos that looked increasingly staged over the years, past awards and commendations that testified to Richard's success and said nothing about her own dreams and aspirations. In their walk-in closet, she hung up the navy dress and changed into her pajamas, noting absently that the outfit had cost more than many people made in a week. It was a costume, really, like everything else in her life. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about her volunteer work at the literacy center. There was a woman there, Maria, who was learning to read at age 52 so she could help her grandchildren with their homework. Maria's face lit up every time she successfully read a new sentence, every small victory celebrated like a major triumph. When was the last time Eleanor had felt that kind of genuine joy? When was the last time anything in her life had felt real? She was brushing her teeth when Richard finally came upstairs, loosening his tie and talking on his Bluetooth headset to someone about polling numbers in suburban districts. He changed into his pajamas while continuing his conversation, never acknowledging her presence. They lay in bed on opposite sides of their king-size mattress, the space between them feeling infinite. Richard was still on his phone, the blue glow illuminating his face as he scrolled through messages and news alerts. Eleanor stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the nights that had ended exactly like this over the past few years. How had they become strangers sharing a bed? "Richard?" she said softly. He didn't look up from his phone. "When was the last time we talked? Really talked?" "We talk all the time." His response was distracted, automatic. "About your campaign, about appearances, about logistics. When was the last time we talked about us?" This time he did look up, confusion crossing his features. "What do you mean?" Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The fact that he didn't understand what she meant was perhaps the most heartbreaking part of all. "Never mind. Good night." "Good night." Richard was already looking back at his phone. Eleanor lay awake for a long time that night, listening to her husband's breathing eventually slow into sleep, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark each passing hour. Somewhere around 2 a.m., she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to call Margaret tomorrow, and then she was going to start planning a life that was truly her own. The next morning began like every other morning in the Blackwood house. Richard was up at 5:30 a.m. for his workout, followed by a protein shake and a review of the day's schedule with his assistant, while Eleanor prepared his coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, served in the blue ceramic mug his mother had given him when he won his first election. But this morning, something was different. Eleanor moved through the familiar routine while mentally rehearsing the conversation she would have with Margaret later. For the first time in years, she was going to tell someone the complete truth about her marriage, about her life, about the dreams she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. "David wants to schedule a weekend campaign swing through the northern counties," Richard said, scrolling through his tablet while drinking his coffee. "I'll probably be gone Friday through Sunday." "All right." Eleanor buttered his toast, noting absently that he preferred whole wheat now. When had that changed? When had she stopped knowing small details about his preferences because he'd stopped sharing them with her? "You should probably plan something with your book club or whatever. Keep yourself busy." Book club or whatever. Eleanor had left her book club 2 years ago when the campaign schedule made it impossible to attend regularly. Richard either didn't remember or hadn't noticed. "I'll figure something out," she said. Richard kissed her cheek on his way out, the same perfunctory gesture he'd been making for months, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and the echo of his footsteps on marble. Eleanor waited until she heard his car pull out of the driveway before reaching for her phone. Her hands were shaking slightly as she dialed Margaret's number. "Ellie!" Margaret's warm voice filled the line, immediately making Eleanor feel less alone. "I've been worried about you." Eleanor walked out to the back patio, needing to be surrounded by something alive and growing. The garden she designed and planted in the early years of their marriage was in full bloom, roses and lavender and jasmine, creating a riot of color and fragrance that felt like a small rebellion against the sterile perfection of the house's interior. "Maggie,"
she said, using her sister's childhood nickname. "I think I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble? Are you okay? Is it Richard?" Eleanor sank into one of the teak chairs she'd chosen for their aesthetic appeal rather than their comfort. Everything in her life chosen for how it looked rather than how it felt. "I'm not okay. And yes, it's Richard, but it's also me. It's everything." She told Margaret everything about the loneliness that had become so constant she'd stopped noticing it until recently, about the real estate brochures hidden in her desk drawer, about feeling like a prop in her own life, an accessory to Richard's ambition rather than a partner in their marriage. "Last night at the fundraiser," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly, "he gave a speech about education reform and mentioned my volunteer work. Everyone applauded, and I should have felt proud, but instead I felt angry. He was using me, Maggie, using my work, my life, as a talking point, and I don't even think he was conscious of it. I don't think he sees me as a person anymore. I'm just part of his political image." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but direct. "How long have you felt this way?" "I don't know. It happened so gradually. Little by little, I became less myself and more what he needed me to be. The perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect campaign asset. I lost myself somewhere along the way, and I don't even know when it happened." "Ellie, have you talked to Richard about this?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How can I talk to someone who doesn't have time to listen? His phone is more important than I am. His campaign staff know more about his thoughts and feelings than I do. We live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, but we might as well be strangers." "What do you want to do?" The question hung in the air between them. What did Eleanor want? It had been so long since anyone had asked her that, so long since she'd even asked herself. "I want to leave," she said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. "I want to leave and find out who I am when I'm not Mrs. Richard Blackwood. I want to wake up in the morning and make choices that are mine, not calculated for their political impact. I want to matter to someone, even if that someone is just me." "Then leave." The simplicity of Margaret's response was shocking. Eleanor had expected arguments, reasons why she should stay, reminders of her commitments and obligations. "It's not that simple, Maggie. Richard's career will survive without you propping it up. Ellie, you're 46 years old. If you don't make a change now, when will you? When Richard becomes a senator? When he runs for president? There will always be another campaign, another reason to wait. Your life is happening right now." Eleanor closed her eyes and let the truth of that statement wash over her. Her life was happening right now, and she was missing it. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of course you are. You're talking about changing everything. But what scares you more, starting over or spending the next 20 years exactly where you are?" That evening, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in months. She cooked for herself. Richard had called to say he'd be eating dinner with potential donors, so instead of preparing salmon with dill sauce, Eleanor made pasta with marinara, simple food that reminded her of her childhood, of Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house where conversation flowed freely and laughter came easily. She ate at the kitchen island instead of the formal dining room, looking out at her garden while she thought about Margaret's question. What scared her more? She thought about the cottage in Oregon, about the possibility of teaching again, about having conversations with people who wanted to know what she thought rather than who she knew. She thought about the woman she used to be before she became half of a political power couple, before her dreams became secondary to someone else's ambition. And for the first time in years, the future looked like something other than an endless repetition of the same scripted performance. When Richard came home that night, Eleanor was in bed reading, actually reading, not just holding a book as a prop while her mind wandered. He undressed quietly, supposedly trying not to disturb her, and slipped into bed with his phone. "How was dinner?" she asked. "Productive. The Morrisons are in for $25,000 and their friends are interested in hosting an event." Richard settled back against his pillows, scrolling through messages. "What did you do tonight?" "I cooked dinner for myself. Pasta." Richard looked up from his phone, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "You don't usually eat pasta." The comment struck Eleanor as profoundly sad. He was right. She hadn't eaten pasta in years because Richard preferred protein and vegetables. She'd changed her eating habits, like so many other things, to accommodate his preferences. And now he found it noteworthy that she'd made food she enjoyed. "I thought I'd try something different," she said. Richard nodded absently and returned to his phone. Within minutes, he was asleep, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and the growing certainty that different was exactly what she needed. The campaign office buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, phones ringing, volunteers stuffing envelopes, young